Weezer. Either you love him or you hate him. And if you love him, then you kinda gotta hate him a little bit. Very few bands are so consistently inconsistent with their output as Weezer. One minute they're releasing some of their best material, then they get bad again, then turn around and put out some really solid stuff like nothing happened. This roller coaster of a discography, along with other aspects, have garnered Weezer an infamous reputation. But hey, they're the Star Wars of music. Nobody hates them more than their fans, who conversely are the most likely to support them. As someone who's been into Weezer since fall 2022, I can tell you that they not only fit in snugly with my music taste, but that the rumors are true and this band has some crazy ups and downs. But for about a year of me liking Weezer, I never really ventured beyond the albums considered to be good. That all changed in fall 2023, when a thought popped in my head. I wanted to experience Weezer's discography for myself. I wanted to see what makes Weezer the band they are, and why everyone has such a love-hate relationship with them. So I decided I would have to listen to everything Weezer had put out in order. But knowing me, I wouldn't just be listening to these 15 albums and 4 EPs. Why are there this many? No, I actually like owning the music I like. So I would also be buying every single Weezer album on CD. From there, my goal was to purchase every single Weezer album plus seasons on CD, listen to them, write my thoughts, and ultimately make this video. No demos, no compilation albums, just what you see on screen right now. Fortunately, I had already purchased a few of their albums, those being Blue, Pinkerton, Green, Maladroit, EWBAITE, and White, and had listened to all of those except for Maladroit. I had intentions to do so, I just got carried away with this project, okay? With that being said, I soon embarked on my journey. So I'm going to do something really stupid today. So right now it is November the 10th, 2023. So over the past week or so, I had this really stupid idea. It was that I would buy every single Weezer album and then listen to it. And I know what you're thinking. Why aren't you just, listening to them on streaming? Or, just listening to the YouTube uploads that certainly exist? And that's a good question. I don't really have a good answer to that. It's just, I like hoarding things, I guess. I don't know. And I think it would just make for a funny video if I bought all their albums on CD physically and then listened to them. And then talk about them, which is this is definitely an original idea that nobody has had before. Absolutely, this is a completely original idea, because the others, they didn't waste money to do it. I don't know when this video is going to come out though, because I'm in the process of working on the Neighborhoods video. I'll keep you updated as I waste money. Why am I doing this? My first stop was probably my most important, as there were not one but 2 record stores at this location. The first had OK Human and All of Seasons, which I wasn't expecting to knock out All of Seasons in one fell swoop, as it wasn't too common for me to find all 4 of them at once, but I wasn't complaining, especially after I found out that since they're EPs, they cost half as much. The first store also had the Teal album, which I knowingly didn't pick up, not because I wasn't counting it, but because I knew I could save another $10. How, you may ask? Well, I had an ace up my sleeve in the form of buying used, as the second store only sold used CDs, which also meant that I could snag the bulk of their 2000s catalog. In addition to Teal, I managed to grab the Red album, Raditude, and Hurley, with the latter 2 even being their deluxe versions, and Hurley still being sealed. While this did mean I had to pay slightly more for those 2, it was worth it since their older releases are a little bit harder to find now new. But just by going to one location, I managed to pick up 9 with only 4 to go. With that, I raced to my second stop at a speed probably not legal in most of the lower 48 states, keeping my road rage to a minimum with the Strokes blasting in my SUV speakers. Upon arrival, I marched my way to the record store on the complete other side of where I parked, and bought Pacific Daydream, the Black Album, and Make Believe. I paid, walked out of the store, all while having this feeling of euphoria that I had in fact purchased every Weezer album. But right as I was about halfway up the escalator, I remembered Van Weezer existed. That feeling of glee quickly turned into dread, then into anger. I don't remember if that store even had Van Weezer, or if I just forgot to grab that CD when I was there, but I didn't want to go back and check because I wasn't keen on being that guy. So I swung all the way to the other side of town, to a mall I hate, to buy Van Weezer. I wonder what cool people do on Saturdays. So I hurriedly stomped my way to a 3rd record store to buy the album that had driven me crazy when I was first getting into CD collecting. Because when I wanted to buy the Blue album, they always had like 15,000 copies of Van Weezer in stock. But now that I actually wanted to buy it, I couldn't find it and had to go all the way to a place I hate to find it, and With a glint of dedication in my eyes, I found the album, placed a $20 bill on the counter, and walked out. I had done it. I bought every Weezer album. Over the following month, I would begin what I dubbed the Weezathon, where I would listen to one Weezer album a day, every day, in release order, with the exception of Seasons, which I did all in a day, starting on December 8th, 2023, and concluding on the 23rd. And no, I didn't intentionally time it to end the day before Christmas Eve, it just kind of worked out that way. As I listened to these albums, I took an excessive amount of notes about what I thought about each song, as well as a summary on the albums as a whole at the end. Well, that's $200 I'm never getting back. Anyway, I've yapped on long enough about making poor financial decisions, so it's high time I dive into each album and uncover what makes Weezer... Weezer. I'm getting used to the new setup because usually I had my computer here, but it's right here, so if I'm looking off in this direction a lot, that's why. To be honest, what can I say about the Blue Album that hasn't already been said a million times before? This album has more than earned its reputation as a modern classic. Pretty much every song is a bop, filled to the brim with catchy hooks. Even if this album is ultimately for geeks, it wears it on its sleeve, and while the lyrics, even though they're a little odd at times, have this undeniable charm to them that, when paired with the admittedly simple instrumentals, give this record a distinct sound and energy that I personally really enjoy. And while the Blue Album is a pretty fun listen overall, it doesn't shy away from some darker subject matter. See my favorite track from the album, The World Has Turned and Left Me Here. I don't know what it is, but that acoustic guitar at the start just scratches a specific itch for me that no other song does. I just hit my microphone. And of course, how could I forget the iconic Say It Ain't So, a song about Rivers Cuomo's relationship with his father and later stepfather, now mainly known as the Wrestle with Jimmy song. The big hits off the record like Buddy Holly, the Sweater Song, F*** Off If You Call It Undone, and the aforementioned Say It Ain't So all do a great job at showcasing what Weezer is all about, but the deep cuts off the album aren't anything to be snoozed on, such as the impeccable opener My Name Is Jonas, which is a complete lie because nobody in the band is named Jonas. There's also the fun as hell Surf Wax America and the chill in the garage, because Rivers is the only man capable of making the word garage one syllable. However, this album isn't flawless in my opinion. I'm not too big on No One Else. The instrumental is pretty good, but the lyrics just bring it down a peg for me, which it took me into watching Abigail DeVoe's video on the Blue Album to realize that this song is meant as satire. It's also a really good video, by the way. You should check it out. It is still my least favorite track on the album, but it probably has something to do with it coming immediately after My Name Is Jonas, which is like one of the best songs on this album by far. Also, I know everybody loves Only in Dreams, but to me, it's just the song where nothing happens. Like, the guitar solo at the end is killer, don't get me wrong, but the song just goes on way too fucking long. Like, it didn't need to be 8 minutes. Did we need all of this build-up? Like, I think it could have worked in like 5. Despite all of this, I still really like the Blue Album. Could you tell? And what is probably one of my favorite aspects of this album is its cover. Truth be told, this is my favorite album cover of all time, not just because of the admittedly pretty decent memes, but because of how just stupidly simple the whole thing is. It gives you everything you need to know about not only the album, but the band as a whole before you hear even a single note of music. It's rare that an album cover can transcend the album it's attached to and become a symbol of the band or artist as a whole. There's loads more I could talk about with this album, such as the iconic music video for Buddy Holly, Rick Ocasek's standout production, and how the timing of the album's release around the death of Kurt Cobain gave Weezer a lot of the same success that Green Day and The Offspring achieved at the same time, and also the memes. If I had to sum up this album in one phrase, it'd be the same description I gave to its cover. Stupidly simple. I don't mean that in a negative way, because there really isn't too much to this album when you think about it. But it's in that simplicity that Weezer finds their strength. Those awkward, geeky lyrics, laid-back instrumentals that chug along at a steady pace, tight sound, and easygoing energy never fail to disappoint with this album for me. It's a really great collection of power pop songs that absolutely deserves its positive reputation. And hey, the album syncs up with Bug's Life, so it must be good. Before I get started, some light context is required. While the Blue Album would skyrocket Weezer to fame, the band didn't take it too well, specifically frontman Rivers Cuomo, who enrolled in Harvard University and isolated himself from the world following a corrective leg surgery. The other members of the band, Brian Bell, Matt Sharp, and Patrick Wilson, would also busy themselves during this time with their own personal side projects. It was this period in Cuomo's life and a desire to be taken seriously as an artist that ideas for a follow-up to Blue would begin to take shape. Originally envisioned as a space-themed rock opera, the project was gradually refined into the album we know today, Pinkerton, which went in a darker direction than its predecessor with a raw sound and personal lyrics. At the time of its release, Pinkerton was panned, but these days it's regarded as a masterpiece on the same level, if not better than Blue. Anyway, Pinkerton is an album that I have a very strange relationship with. Is it deserving of the critical roasting that it got in 1996? No, but is it a masterpiece? I don't think it is, in my opinion. Out of any album I've listened to, not just Weezer, Pinkerton is the one that I'm the most 50-50 on. That's not to say I think it's mediocre. I like it, but for everything I like about it, I can name you the same number of things I don't. I like the raw and unrefined sound of the album, but at the same time, the utter lack of production can make the album feel like a demo compilation. The guitar solos on this album kick ass and are some of Weezer's best, but at times it feels more like a Rivers solo project than a Weezer album. Not to mention, Rivers' screams are pretty hit or miss. The lyrics, I think, are the biggest reason why I can't bring myself to love this album. Many tracks go too deep, in my opinion, where I feel like it's less of Rivers being brave and more so that he's oversharing to the point where some of the songs actually made me feel a little uncomfortable. Examples of this being Why Bother, Tired of Sex, most of El Scorcho, and the infamous Across the Sea, the latter of which is based on a letter sent to him from an 18-year-old Japanese fan while isolated at Harvard following his surgery, which explains the song's questionable lyrics and why it's my least favorite song on the album. How it made the cut, but I Just Threw Out the Love of My Dreams was saved for the deluxe edition released years later, is beyond me. I actually think that Across the Sea is the perfect example of what makes Pinkerton so fascinating to me. It knows that the mindset it's presenting is unhealthy and perverted, but it isn't reveling in that. Instead, it knows that the mentality it's presenting is toxic, and it multiple times pleads for things to get better. So if you feel grossed out by some of the songs, that's the point, even if I still don't like it. However, I did dig quite a few of the songs. Get You is catchy as hell. The Good Life is about as close as this album gets to having a Blue Album sounding song. Butterfly is a hauntingly beautiful closer. And my favorite song on the album, Pink Triangle, is overall really solid. And while I did say that Tired of Sex is a song I'm not too big on, I do feel like it does a really solid job of giving the listener a good idea of what the entire album is going to be like. Pinkerton is an album that I like the idea of more than its execution. Its greatest strength is that it's a raw, unrefined look into the mind of a struggling artist. But on that same token, its greatest downfall is that it's a raw, unrefined look into the mind of a struggling artist. And while I do like this album, I wouldn't say I enjoyed it. Pinkerton is not an enjoyable album to listen to. In a weird way, it falls into a similar category as Rage Against the Machine, personally, in the sense that I have to be in the right mood to listen to it. Pinkerton isn't something I can just have in the background while driving, much like Rage Against the Machine for me. If I had to choose between the two, I vastly prefer Blue to Pinkerton. Blue is just objectively better to me in every single way. I hope I presented my thoughts on this album the best I could. I could have talked for way longer, but we need to move on. Damn, the only thing I'm missing is a Green Album shirt. In my opinion, the Green Album is the definition of generic. Not that it's bad, far from it. It's just that they played it really safe with this one. A collection of radio-friendly rock songs that aren't trying to offend anyone and nothing more. Which was more than intentional because following Pinkerton's immense backlash, the band wanted to get as far away from that sound as possible. But in doing so, Green feels like it's Blue's copycat younger brother that in trying desperately to emulate its success, fails to recapture what made the original so special in the first place, even down to things like Rick Ocasek returning to produce, and it being a color album, arguably starting that trend since the Blue Album was just meant to be self-titled. Don't get me wrong, I still like aspects of this album. Hashpipe is a great song that steadily chugs along at a pace that's a treat to listen to. Also, I'm on Team Asswipe. Crab is one that surprised me upon re-listen. Its slower speed makes it pretty fun to groove out to, and the guitars on that song are really crisp. Knockdown Dragout, on the other hand, asks the question, what if Weezer made all the small things? Which is weird considering that this song was based around Worry Rock from Nimrod. Almost forgot the name of the song because... I don't know why I forgot the name of the song almost for a second. It's not that I don't like Nimrod. Nimrod's great. But hey, the song has a fun energy to it that I really enjoy. I could say the same for the opener, Don't Let Go. Ooh, whoa, whoa. Except this song brings back, like, some really bad memories for me. But if it wasn't for that, I'd really like this song. But that's not the world we live in, so get in the songs that give me Vietnam flashbacks corner with Arctic Monkeys. A lot of this album just feels the same. Like, they had 3 ideas and just repeated them over and over and over again. Glorious Day had potential, but it sort of failed in its execution for me. Smile and Simple Pages are fine, I guess. And Oh Girlfriend as a closer, while it might be growing on me, like, a little bit, leaves me wanting more. It's not a bad song, but it just really feels like it wants me to feel something, and I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling anything with this one. Like I said earlier, these aren't bad songs, just generic. However, the one song I adore the most from Green, which is easily its biggest, is Island in the Sun, which for the longest time was my favorite Weezer song. A chill, fun song that isn't anything too deep, but that simplicity is its strength, much like with Blue. Those little hips and the strummed guitar at the start do a fantastic job of setting the tone for the entire song. However, instead of lyrics about being a fucking nerd like with Blue, it's about living in the moment with those around you and having fun, like with Green. Island in the Sun was the first non-Blue song I listened to. When I first started getting into Weezer, I mainly stuck to the Blue album for a bit, and Island in the Sun played a big role in showing me that Weezer was more than just the Blue album. But it's when I started listening to this song that's most important for me. September of 2022 to around January of 2023 was like this weird transitional period of my life. I had overcome the challenges that year had presented and come out stronger because of it, but future heartaches were still a little ways away. My life was sort of at a standstill. Was everything perfect? No. During this time, I lost both friends and family in different ways, but things were at least stable, and I was okay with that. I feel like the first music video, the Mexican wedding one, perfectly encapsulates this for me. It's those moments in life where things may not be 100% perfect, but you're still able to have fun and live in the moment with those around you and enjoy life. And that's what I'll always associate this song with, and why I'll always hold a special place in my heart. Is Green amazing? Far from it. But it still has its moments, even if they're sandwiched next to mediocrity. And for an album where the guitar solos are literally just the verse melody, I'd say it sticks the landing. Not every song is a home run, but it still has some pretty solid tracks that I like to come back to. Following that up in 2002 was Maladroit. It was at this point in the Weezathon that for the next 5 albums, I would be going in pretty much blind on each listen. What I can conclusively say about Maladroit is that I really do not have that much to say about Maladroit. It was good. Just good. Nothing more, nothing less. To me, this was like if Green tried to get a little closer to Pinkerton, but the only element of it that it replicated was having heavier sounding guitars, which I don't hate, but it still sticks really close to that core sound that Green already started. I really enjoyed songs like Burnt Jam with how chill and relaxing it is and having almost a Foo Fighters sounding guitar solo, and the drum in the intro also kind of sounds like I Miss You, like a little bit, but that's just me. Love Explosion's chorus is super catchy and would have easily fit next to songs from Pinkerton. Slave I enjoyed, the heavy intro is rock solid, and the track overall gives me knockdown dragout vibes. Altogether, almost sounds like a Linkin Park song to me, and Possibilities is borderline punk. The big hit from the album, Keep Fishin', took its sweet-ass time growing on me. Originally, I wasn't too big on how the tempo change was worked into the song, but I slowly found myself coming back to the song more and more, and really digging it. It's the song that I easily have listened to the most from Maladroit. The single version is also pretty good, and the music video for Keep Fishin' is probably my favorite Weezer video of all time. I never knew I needed to hear Weezer play a song with the Muppets. Dope Nose, on the other hand, is alright. I do like the song, but in comparison to Keep Fishin', which is the other hit, I feel like it's a bit of a step down. Dope Nose is actually sort of the best segue into what holds this album back for me. Because pretty much all 13 songs on this record feel about the same. Unlike an album like Insomniac, where it works to the album's benefit, here it's its ultimate downfall. In the moment, I'm enjoying myself, but the tracks fail to leave much of a lasting impression on me. Hell, I had to listen to the songs that I listed as my favorites in the notes while writing the script just to remember what they sounded like, since I hadn't heard them since the Weezathon. And I really haven't come back to many of them since. To me, Maladroit is a by-the-numbers Weezer album with a little extra distortion and some shreddier than normal guitar solos. It's not generic like Green, rather it's safe. Which is strange seeing as they got fan input on the demos they uploaded for this album, but at the same time, it doesn't surprise me that this is what they ended up putting out. I wouldn't call it a compromise album, rather, it's an album for Weezer fans, and in that regard, it does a good job. But as I see it, Maladroit is better than Green, and it doesn't really shoot much higher than that. Minor thing of note, in 2004, Weezer released a DVD called Video Capture Device that had music videos, behind-the-scenes stuff. I only mention it because I recently bought this, and I haven't watched it, but I own it, and I feel the need to bring it up. I feel like if I had to point to one album where Weezer took a turn for the worst, I'd probably say it's Make Believe. Before this, their worst was just But for me, Make Believe was the first Weezer album that I'd say wasn't all that good. Where previous Weezer albums I was hard on because I wasn't fond of their sound or their songwriting or whatever, at the end of the day, I could at least say they were focused. Sure, you had some poppier songs and some more depressing songs, but they all felt cut from the same cloth. Make Believe, on the other hand, really didn't know what it wanted to be, and if you've seen Mark But Evil's video on the development of Make Believe, this really wouldn't surprise you. It was literally trying to be Green and Pinkerton at the same time, which is next to impossible because those two albums are so different from one another. I think a shining example of what I'm talking about is the song This Is Such a Pity. The lyrics are super depressing, but instead of an emotional sound to complement it, it's straight up an 80s pop song, and those lyrics end up getting lost in the mix. It's practically begging to be a Pinkerton or even Maladroit song, but instead they made it pop. I'm not saying that pop with depressing lyrics can't work. It worked pretty well for Paramore. But to me, I can clearly tell that that wasn't the intent with this song. Instead, it feels like it's trying to disguise the lyrics so it can appeal to the most amount of people. But what makes even less sense is that This Is Such a Pity comes right after Hold Me, which goes all out on being dark and depressing, so why they felt the need to make it sound really poppy when it's right next to the most depressing sounding song on the album arguably is beyond me. Speaking of Hold Me, it's easily my favorite song on the album. The opening guitar line is perfection, and when the rest of the band comes in, it just brings the whole entire song together and has a kick-ass solo to boot. That's not the only song I'm fond of with this album. The Damage in Your Heart is pretty solid, with great lyrics, and the little guitar plucks in the verses are a nice touch. I think it does the whole sad lyrics with an upbeat instrumental thing pretty well. The reason being is that it doesn't sound super happy, so that sad feeling is still somewhat preserved. I also really enjoyed the closer Haunt You Every Day. It's a straight up Pinkerton song, not only in like the feel and construction of the whole thing, but also how it knows that the mindset it's presenting is unhealthy in the lyrics. It 100% deserves to be regarded as an underrated gem from this album. And I know a lot of you are waiting on me to absolutely rip Beverly Hills a new one, but being honest, I think Beverly Hills gets way too much hate. I actually quite enjoy that song a lot of the time. Sure, River's vocal flow is a little dry, and there's way too much wah pedal on the solo, but it's just a dumb, fun song, and there's nothing wrong with having fun, especially when it comes to Weezer. Perfect Situation, on the other hand, is iffy. It's the exact thing I think of when Weezer song comes to mind, and is also a shining example of woes being used in a song poorly. They don't add anything to the song, and honestly just feel like placeholders for actual lyrics. The rest of the album ranges from unfocused mediocrity to downright bad. I originally was fond of Freak You Out, but as time went on, I slowly realized that it's not that good of a song. We Are All on Drugs just screams sellout and is just cringy as hell. But what I can say for this entire album, even certain songs that I do like, is that it's overproduced, which is a word you are going to hear many times in this video. Everything feels just too manufactured and unnecessary. On the poppier cuts, it can kind of work to the song's benefit, but on the darker songs, it is super distracting, especially when you can just hear the Pinkerton and Green sounds fighting for control. It's even weirder considering that this album is produced by Rick Rubin, of all people. Like, Rick, you've produced some really good albums. Why'd you drop the ball on Weezer? All in all, I'm not a big fan of Make Believe. In trying to be both fun commercial Weezer and raw emotional Weezer, it fails at being cohesive and is an album with a glaring identity crisis. But what I think could have saved Make Believe is that it should have been a double album. One disc could have been entirely dedicated to the happy-sounding songs like Beverly Hills and Perfect Situation, and the other composed entirely of the more depressing-sounding songs. That way you could have had the best of both worlds and not had to force these two sounds to compete with one another. Would it have been perfect if done this way? Probably not. The album probably still would have had a lot of flaws, but I feel like if they separated it into two distinct discs, it probably would have felt a little bit more cohesive. One more thing of note, in between Make Believe and the Red Album, Rivers Cuomo would release this, Alone, the home recordings of Rivers Cuomo, a demo collection that eventually spawned a whole series of releases that continues to this day, I'm pretty sure. I own the first one physically. I liked it well enough for what it is. It's not required listening or anything, but it's just a pretty cool novelty to own. Going into the Red Album, I had no preconceived notion of what to expect. I had heard every take under the sun for this album, everything from it's one of their best albums ever made to utter garbage. So why is it that this album is their best since Pinkerton? The Red Album is the first album that genuinely surprised me. I went in expecting another Make Believe or Green, but I instead was treated to an album that saw Weezer feel the most comfortable in being themselves since Pinkerton. It's kind of a shame that this album doesn't really have much of a legacy outside of the Pork and Beans music video and Rivers wearing a cowboy hat. Does Red have its flaws? Yeah. There's more than a few stinkers on the track listing. Looking at you, Everybody Get Dangerous, and Cold Dark World. Sorry, Scott. But most of the track listing is a collection of pretty solid tunes that aren't overproduced. Unlike Make Believe, Red was focused and had distinguishable parts to it. And to achieve that, they made the interesting creative decision to have all the non-Cuomo members sing one song entirely on their own. And while not the most original idea, it does really help give Red its own sense of identity. With two of my favorite songs being Automatic and Thought I Knew, the former being sung by Pat Wilson and the latter by Brian Bell. Thought I Knew is pretty laid back, and there's a Daft Punk song that the drums in the opening remind me of whenever I listen to it. And Automatic goes so hard, and I don't know why this is, but it's really nostalgic and takes me back to being a kid in the early 2010s. The opener, Troublemaker, is essentially a happier sounding version of The Good Life from Pinkerton, which sounds like it would be a terrible idea, but it's executed in a way that always gets me feeling pumped up whenever I listen to it. The Arts and Crafts line always gets a smile out of me, and I didn't know I needed to hear Rivers say biatch and kiods. The big hit Pork and Beans was a song that I wasn't too big on when I heard it in isolation, but quickly came around on when I heard it in context with the rest of the album. Not to mention the phenomenal music video that harnessed the internet in the best way possible and even won a Grammy. It's a product of its time in the best way possible. It's something that you just couldn't make today because the internet has grown so much in the 16 years since its release. But it does make me wonder what a Pork and Beans redux would look like today. Rickrolling wasn't even really a thing when the video came out, so it'd be really interesting to see what they'd include. My absolute favorite song from the album is Heart Songs. I really like the campfire vibe it has going for it, and it's a nice shout out to all the artists that Rivers either grew up on or have influenced him in some way over the years. I honestly kind of hope that if anyone ever decides to do a cover of Heart Songs, that they rewrite it to shout out their Heart Songs, kind of like what Fall Out Boy did when they covered We Didn't Start the Fire. They didn't just do a straight cover, they changed it to fit things that have happened since the release of the original song. But, I just think that'd be kind of cool. Also, the line about Will Smith in this song aged phenomenally. All in all, the Red Album was certainly a welcome surprise for me. You can clearly tell that the band had a blast putting together this album, and I had a really good time listening to it too. Normally, an album like this would give me hope for a band to turn things around after falling into a bit of a rut, but I know what came next. This album broke me. What makes an album bad differs from person to person. For some, it's horrible production, bad lyrics, feeling corporate and disingenuous, being cookie cutter and safe, among other reasons. But all of which I've heard describe Raditude at least once before, as this album has an infamous reputation. So was Raditude as bad as some people say it is? In some regards, yes, but I'd be lying if I said there weren't any somewhat decent songs on this album. I'm of the opinion that If You're Wondering If I Want You To, I Want You To is a good song. Sure, it might be a cheesy love song at the end of the day, but it's one of the first songs I think of when fun Weezer is on my mind. And hey, fun Weezer isn't bad. It's Weezer. We're allowed to have fun. The chorus on this song is super catchy, and as a whole, it's super nostalgic for me and takes me back to being a kid. And when I mean a kid, I mean like a little kid. It's kind of like how the opening chords of 21st Century Breakdown are for me. The only difference is I 100% remember hearing I Want You To as a toddler. Speaking of fun, I really dig this album cover. It just makes me smile whenever I see it. What I'd give to feel as happy as the dog on the cover of Raditude for just one moment. Also, R.I.P. Sydney. Another song that I really enjoyed was Put Me Back Together. Comparatively, it's more restrained than a lot of the songs on this album, and something about its melody just works for me. It's far from perfect. The bridge is just okay. Rivers yelling sounds like he's straining his vocals a little bit, and the feedback at the end is way too much. But overall, it's just a really sweet sounding song. Though at the time, there was something about this song that I just couldn't put my finger on as to why I liked it. And then I ended up looking the song up on Weezerpedia, and I found out that Tyson Ritter and Nick Wheeler of the All-American Rejects co-wrote the song, and I can definitely hear their influence on it. Truth be told, the All-American Rejects were like the first band I ever really got into on my own, and were massively influential as to what I'd end up getting into later on in life. So it was really cool finding out that they co-wrote probably the best song on an album full of... Also, I've been thinking about potentially making a video about the All-American Rejects. So is that like something any of you would be interested in seeing? I know they're not exactly like the most popular band out there, so covering them would be a bit of a gamble, and something that I'd only really do if I knew there was a demand for it. So if you want to see me talk about the All-American Rejects at some point in the future, just like leave a comment. I'm not saying it's guaranteed to happen. There's way more important videos I want to make. But still, the rest of the album ranges from peak mediocrity to soulless baseball stadium butt rock to some of the absolute worst pieces of music I have ever listened to. Not to mention that pretty much every single song on this album is overproduced to shit. What made me not like Make Believe that much is that it was having an identity crisis. But Raditude, it knew exactly what it wanted to be, and that's what I hate about it. It's trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator in a way that makes Green look like Pinkerton in comparison. Tracks like I'm Your Daddy and Girl Got Hot just make me cringe in embarrassment, as they both feature an at the time nearly 40-year-old Rivers Cuomo acting like he's 17. In the Mall, I think, was trying to go for like a Maladroit sound, but in the process forgot what made Maladroit actually pretty decent. Tripping Down the Freeway is just more baseball dad rock that makes me feel nothing other than shame while listening to it. The closing song, I Don't Want to Let You Go, just gives me elementary school play closing number vibes. It really wants me to feel something, and I just feel pain because that song sucks. Also, I really want to know what they were on when they made Love Is the Answer. That chorus probably would have been good if paired with like literally any other instrumental. But no, they went with sitar, and I feel like I'm on shrooms. I could also go on a super long-winded tangent about all the reasons why Can't Stop Partying is in the running for the worst song I have ever heard, But instead, I'm going to show you a selfie that I took of myself while actually listening to Can't Stop Partying for the first time, because I feel like it perfectly encapsulates all I wanted to say about that song. So here it is. Yep, yep, you can see the pain in my eyes. Also, if you were wondering, my copy is in fact the deluxe edition, meaning it comes with not one, but 2 discs. Look at that. Woo. But I didn't listen to the second disc because I didn't want to. Outside of the 2 songs I listed as enjoying, Raditude is an out-of-touch, overproduced, dated mess of an album. In fact, I doubt this album really even sounded in date back in 2009. Its only job was to be popular, and if it meant having 90% of the track listing sound like absolute in the process, then who cares? But even then, it would be Raditude that firmly put Weezer in the past tense for the general public. Speaking from personal experience, outside of their cover of Africa and to a slightly lesser extent Records, I haven't heard anything post-Raditude while out and about. This album would essentially tarnish their already fragile reputation forever. While Raditude is by far the worst Weezer album, I wouldn't go as far as to say this is the worst album I've ever listened to. It's not irredeemably bad, and I can think of at least 3 other albums that are worse than it. But it still stands that this is Weezer's worst album. Fortunately, they'd never reach a low like this ever again. Coming off of an album like Raditude, the only way to go is up, and Hurley certainly was an improvement. Hurley is an album that exists. That's all I can really say about it. I 100% get why nobody talks about Hurley. Not because it's bad, but because this album has literally nothing going for it. Most of these songs are just okay rock songs and nothing else. Within the next few days of the Weezathon, I already forgot what pretty much all of them sounded like. It's not like Maladroit where I remembered liking the songs in the moment and had notes to take. Even at the time of me listening to Hurley, I was struggling on things to say. I remember Smart Girls feeling like a Raditude cut, and the ironically titled lead single Memories was fine, even if the Shmo Yoho collab and YouTube Invasion as a whole was more memorable than the entire album. Oh my god, it's Weezer! The album isn't overproduced, which is a plus, but I did notice a distinct increase in the use of synths on this album, which made it feel like Weezer were trying just like a little too hard to be the Killers. This is also Weezer's worst album cover in my opinion. This looks like a post. But the fact that I have next to nothing to say about Hurley speaks volumes. Weezer improved, but in doing so put out a nothing album. It's better than another bad album, but I can't really talk about these songs because the songs themselves offer nothing worthy of discussion. There's next to no depth in the lyrics, nothing of note in the instrumentation, not to mention the album has 0 replay value at all. Even the worst Weezer albums gave me something to come back to. Hurley is probably the worst thing an album can be. Forgettable. But in being so forgettable, it makes it memorable in a twisted way. It wasn't painful to sit through, but it wasn't a particularly fulfilling listen. Rather, it's a step in the right direction. A tiny step, but a step nonetheless, especially considering what would come afterwards. I like this one. Following Hurley, Weezer would take a bit of a break from releasing music, other than a You Might Think cover on the Cars 2 soundtrack, which actually was the first Weezer song I've ever heard, so it was really cool finding out that when I was first getting into Weezer, that, you know, they made a song for a movie I watched as a kid, so it was like I was like always destined to become a Weezer fan. I'll shut up now. Over this 4-year break, the band toiled away on their comeback. Originally a 3-act concept album known as Ecce Homo, the project soon morphed into the album Everything Will Be Alright in the End, or EWBAITE for short. If you can't already tell, I adore this album. It's not only their best since Pinkerton or even Blue, but in my opinion is the best album Weezer has ever made and will ever make. Hate me all you want, I don't care. From front to back, EWBAITE is a masterpiece. a title I rarely give to albums. To me, it's the synthesis of everything I love about Weezer in one album. The tight sound, clever songwriting, and crisp production of Blue, the personal nature and epic guitar solos of Pinkerton, and the catchy hooks and fun attitude of the bulk of their 2000s catalog, all of which are on full display as it feels like the culmination of their entire discography up until that point. Everyone is firing on all cylinders, and you can tell that Weezer had a point to prove with this album, that after a decade of mediocrity, they still have that spark in them. Something else I really enjoy is the themes of this album. Despite the 3-act structure being ditched early on, EWBAITE is still a concept album. I don't have time to get into the whole lore behind this album, but what's important is that the songs are divided into 3 thematic groupings. Belladonna, about Cuomo's relationship with women, Patriarcha, about Cuomo's relationship with father figures, and The Panopticon Artist, about Cuomo's relationship with fans. While not being sorted in any particular order, instead the songs are scattered throughout this album, these still provide a interesting thematic structure to the album and help compartmentalize certain aspects. EWBAITE starts with the phenomenal opener, Ain't Got Nobody, which, much like all of Weezer's best albums, really gives you a strong feel for what the rest of the record has to offer. It really feels like it's making the statement that Weezer is back, which you could extend to the entire album. Not to mention that this is probably one of the most upbeat songs about being lonely ever. Back to the Shack is pretty good, considering it's basically just Rivers apologizing for the past decade of music, which on one hand I can understand, but on the other it's like there was some pretty solid stuff released there. I mean, you don't have to apologize for all of it, it's fine. I'm also quite fond of Eulogy for a Rock Band, mainly because it kind of encapsulates how it felt putting to bed my old YouTube projects. More so the earlier of the two, because despite gaining minimal success, it still felt like we could take on the world. Also, I can't be the only one who notices the similarity between the guitar solo in this song and the chorus of Pink Triangle. My 2 favorite songs off the record, I've Had It Up to Here and The British Are Coming, are not only placed back to back, but fade into one another. I've Had It Up to Here is epic. It's a total earworm, and you can just hear the Queen influence and the sheer bombast of the whole thing. Meanwhile, The British Are Coming is not only my favorite from EWBAITE, but Weezer's discography as a whole. Its chorus, while simple, is so catchy that only 4 words is all it needs. The pre-chorus is also really fun too. I also appreciate that the lyrics are a smart metaphor for gaining independence from your parents. It's quite clever and makes the history nerd in me smile. Not to mention that the instrumental adds this atmospheric gravitas to the whole thing that really drives the song home. Da Vinci is really unique, and it has this sense of progression that I adore not only with it, but with others from the album too. It starts with the main riff played on acoustic guitar and whistled, and then it's carried throughout the song on acoustic guitar and the bass, and then you're reminded of it after the first chorus, and then it's all brought together at the end of the song with it being played on piano. It really gets the feeling that the song is going somewhere and it's building up to something in a really satisfying way. Meanwhile, Go Away is a nice duet between Cuomo and Bethany Constantino of Best Coast. I hope I said your name right. Which it really makes the song stand out from the rest of Weezer's discography because it's the only duet in the entire thing. And how could I not mention the epic closer, the Future Scope trilogy, which is 3 songs that essentially are just one big guitar solo. Anonymous is my favorite of the 3, and the piano is just straight up 21 Guns at the beginning.
Do you know what's worth fighting for?
These 3 songs really tie the whole album together and are an amazing conclusion to what, in my opinion, is Weezer's magnum opus. Out of any album I discuss here, EWBAITE is the one that I feel like is most deserving of its own video. I only scratched the surface for what makes this album so special to me. Not only that, but its rich history and lengthy development time would really lend itself well to a long-form video essay. But damn it, Mark, you beat me to it! Regardless, don't expect me to talk about this album anytime soon. I'll need lots and lots and lots of time to plan on how I'd go about making the video my own. Not to mention, there's loads of stuff I want to talk about first. So when I'm finally ready to face my inner demons, that's when I'll discuss EWBAITE more in depth. It really felt like Weezer knew what they wanted to be on this album. They didn't care about mass appeal and instead opted for the album that they wanted to make, which unfortunately meant that EWBAITE kind of underperformed, and it really sucks that not many people know about this album who aren't in like the Weezer sphere. Regardless, in my opinion, this album was Weezer's peak, As I mentioned, everything I love about Weezer is featured on this album in some way. The track listing is tight, focused, and is paced extremely well, and I have zero qualms saying that EWBAITE is my favorite Weezer album. And fortunately, it would also usher in a brief period where Weezer got good again. The White Album is the last album I listened to pre-Weezathon, and at the time when I first listened to it, I loved it. I remember listening to Pinkerton, Green, and White back-to-back in one night, which was kind of stupid, not gonna lie, and out of those three, this one was easily my favorite. But upon re-listening to the album in full for the first time since then, I found myself liking it a little less than I did the first time. Not to say I didn't like the album, it's still my third favorite Weezer album behind EWBAITE and Blue, but I guess just some of the magic of it wore off after the first initial listen, or I just remembered it being better than it actually was. The California summer/beach theme of the whole album, while not as in-your-face as the guiding themes of EWBAITE, still holds the album together in a really good way. And despite none of the members of the band originating from California, they do manage to capture that sound pretty well. White starts off strong with California Kids, which is one of my favorite Weezer songs of all time, balancing being high-octane and laid back really well. And it's the perfect summer song in my opinion, which makes sense since it's the one that gave White its summer/beach theme. But it's also an oddly nostalgic song in a way, not because I listened to White or California Kids when I was a kid, but it, and to a greater extent the whole album, really encompass what summer sounds like, especially the rose-tinted summer vacation of youth. A time a lot of us can look back on and go, hell yeah, that was a fun time. Wind in Our Sail, to me, is a better Back to the Shack. Instead of apologizing for everything, it's saying that, yeah, we might have made some iffy stuff in the past, but we know what we're going to do now, and we're proud of it. The lead single, Thank God for Girls, is weird. On one hand, the chorus is great, but Rivers' vocal flow on the verses, specifically the third verse, is a little strange. Not to mention, its lyrics are really weird. But my biggest problem with it is it just ends. It didn't feel like it was building towards the song ending. It just stops, and I'm left scratching my head. Some personal favorite songs of mine are King of the World, with just how bombastic it all sounds, as well as Jacked Up with how sleek and different it is. It still feels new after nearly a decade. How was 2016 almost 10 years ago already? Holy shit. Do You Want to Get High sounds ripped straight out of Pinkerton, guitar solo and all. However, I really wish that it exploded more, because it really felt like it was building towards that, but it just never came, which is what's really holding that song back for me. And an easy highlight of the album for me was Summer Elaine and Drunk Dory. It's like if Pork and Beans was from the Blue album. It has this danceable quality to it, alongside a catchy as hell main riff and chorus, and a baller solo, as always. Also kind of sort of find myself in the lyrics. It's just something about them that... However, my absolute favorite song from the White Album, and a top 5 Weezer song in my books, is the closer, Endless Bummer. To me, this is their best closing song. There's something so poignant about it that it just perfectly sums up what the end of summer feels like. Despite it not being super down-tempo, it still evokes this feeling of melancholy with only Rivers and acoustic guitar for most of it, and the hey, hey, hey serves as a nice hook that makes the song feel like a dark take on Island in the Sun, voice crack. And when the rest of the band comes in towards the end, it really brings the song home, and not only carries the twisted Island in the Sun feeling that it already had, but it also evokes Only in Dreams, and oddly Go Away in an interesting way. And then the breakdown at the end of the song specifically has this hauntingly nostalgic quality to it that just really does it for me. I also wrote a comment on the official audio upload of Endless Bummer on Weezer's YouTube channel, and I think it best sums up the song and how I feel about it. This song, the ending breakdown especially, always gets me feeling a weird mix of emotions. I can best describe it as this bittersweet nostalgia. The kind when you look back on it, instead of feeling warm and fuzzy inside, you feel uncomfortable and kind of sad. Like when you're a kid or teenager and it's the last weeks/days of summer, and you're dreading school's return, but there's nothing you can do to stop it, so you just succumb to the inevitable passage of time and embrace the fact that you only have a few days of freedom left. Even if the summer you had wasn't the best and you went through a lot of terrible experiences, you still hate the fact that you have to leave a lifestyle of not caring and shutting out the world behind you. All the while watching the sunset on one of those precious few days you have left, as the leaves nearby look slightly more yellow than they did even a week ago. But years down the road, you look back at that summer with rose-tinted glasses, the bad memories, pain, and heartbreak all washed away from years of internalization, and wish that for just a second that you could relive it all just one more time. At least 4 other people thought that was pretty good. However, White is far from perfect. I already mentioned that I'm mixed on Thank God for Girls, but I also feel similarly to Girl, We Got a Good Thing. It's very Christmas in July feeling, and while it had some solid aspects to it, it was a little boring to me. It also is mildly infuriating that more than half of the song's title is in brackets for literally no reason. I'm also especially not fond of LA Girls. It's just so damn simpy. I guess maybe it's those few songs that made me not like White as much the second time around. The album has some pretty high highs, but in between all that are just songs that are lesser than the rest. I don't want to give the impression that I dislike the White Album. It's great and better than Pinkerton in my book, but I honestly couldn't tell you what it is that made me like this album less. The songs I have problems with aren't bad. I guess I just wasn't as familiar with Weezer when I first listened to it, and I just like some of their other material more now. But even then, there is still phenomenal cuts off of this record, all tied nicely together with a cohesive theme that really gives it some character. White did continue what EWBAITE started, with the band once again receiving critical acclaim, and unlike its predecessor, this album actually performed quite well commercially. So let's keep this streak up, right? The White Album was popular, so it only made sense to keep moving in that direction. But if you thought this would be more of the classic Weezer style, then you'd be mistaken. Instead, the follow-up would be an album entirely made to Rivers Cuomo's liking. He wasn't going to compromise his vision anymore. This time, he was winning. From here on out, I was in uncharted territory. But much like other albums I hadn't listened to until the Weezathon, I was more than aware of this album's divisive reputation. Some say it's a masterpiece, while others think it's worse than Raditude. Now, where do I stand on Pacific Daydream? It's fine, I guess. I feel like you'd have to be high to think that Weezer weren't going to move in a more pop-sounding direction after White. That album had plenty of pop influence all over it, so following its success, it only made sense to continue down the path of what's currently popular. I actually think Weezer going for a more pop sound had quite a bit of potential. I'm not opposed to artists trying to change up their style, since sometimes it can work pretty well. And for some reason, a ton of rock bands, in 2017 specifically, went pop. Like you had Weezer, Paramore, Linkin Park, The Killers, kinda, but they were always pretty pop adjacent for a rock band. Fall Out Boy, sorta, since Mania was supposed to come out in 2017, but it got delayed to 2018. Other rock bands too, probably. Regardless, Weezer going for a more pop sound had some potential to work. But Weezer at their poppiest before Pacific Daydream still felt like Weezer. These songs sound like they were written as pop songs first, and then had more traditional Weezer elements added on retroactively. But what's weird about it is it doesn't really feel like it's trying to appeal to everyone, rather just mimic what was on pop radio at the time. Pacific Daydream is also in the running for the most overproduced album I have ever listened to. Rivers' vocals and the guitars have so much reverb on them that it literally feels like somebody went into GarageBand and cranked the reverb slider to the max. Like, it is just overwhelming how much reverb there is on this album. Meanwhile, Pat's drums don't even sound like they're real drums, and I actually had to do a double take when I went on Weezerpedia and found out that there isn't a drum machine on this album. They don't even sound real. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they were actually a drum machine, because of how synthetic they sound. Also, I don't know if this is just a me problem, but a lot of the time there is just way too much going on in these tracks. Like, there are so many synths and layers to the parts. Like, it is just so overwhelming. It just becomes a wall of sound and a sensory overload. My favorite song from this album is easily Weekend Woman. It honestly is just a really good track. Its chorus is really slick and does lack a lot of the major issues I have with Pacific Daydream as a whole. Like, if the whole album sounded like Weekend Woman, I'd be loving it. But that's not the world we live in, and instead it's a highlight of an album that's just eh. Beach Boys is another really catchy one, even if a lot of the lyrics suck. But it's just really groovy overall. Sweet Mary is also pretty decent, with the vocal melody in the chorus being a highlight. And I did like the opener Mexican Fender at first, but once I re-listened to it, I realized it just came to embody a lot of the problems I have with Pacific Daydream as a whole. On paper, Mexican Fender should work for me, but it just doesn't. The same can easily be said about the closer, Any Friend of Diane. I do want to restate, I don't by any means hate Pacific Daydream. Even songs I do have problems with, like QB Blitz, Happy Hour, and to a much lesser extent Feels Like Summer, they still have elements to them that I do like and I do enjoy. So I can't fully bring myself to hate Pacific Daydream. Overall, this one's a pretty hit or miss record. It's trying to go pop, but it's just has enough of that classic Weezer like feel to it that it feels like it's holding back despite being so in your face about being a pop record. Yet it oddly can feel like the synthesis of pop music in the late 2010s. This album wasn't made for me, for fans, or anybody else but Cuomo. I wouldn't say it's soulless because I can feel genuine passion in plenty of tracks, and I can admire Rivers' untainted creative vision. That's something I can truly admire and have immense respect for with this album. When the end result is this bland, I'm left disappointed. Pacific Daydream feels like something that you'd throw on while cruising down the highway on a summer day just to have some noise playing in the background, which I can tell was probably not the intent of the album. Fans at the time did not take kindly to it. However, some did understand Cuomo's creative vision and appreciated it. And I would argue that to this day, Pacific Daydream is probably the most controversial album in Weezer's discography. But now the band was at a bit of a crossroads. Either revert back to the sound that not only saw commercial success, but fan praise, or, they could try something new again, or continue down the path of pop. But not before we could take a bit of a detour. This is the second album that broke me. So in between Pacific Daydream failing hard and their next album, a fan on Twitter began bugging Weezer about covering Toto's Africa, and after a bit of trolling, Weezer eventually caved. And then out of nowhere, in early 2019, they dropped the Teal album, an album comprised entirely of covers of songs from the late 20th century. Who the hell asked for this album? Genuinely. Like, I get the Africa cover, do the Africa cover, that's its own thing. But who was this album made for exactly? This entire album is the definition of unnecessary. Like, if I Google unnecessary, it just redirects me to the Teal album. Well, I do dog on this album for being unnecessary. I do recognize that no album really is necessary, if you think about it. But Teal is not only super unnecessary, but it feels like a cash grab to ride the coattails of the Africa cover. None of the covers offer anything the originals don't on their own. They're just straight covers of some of the most obvious songs to do covers of. I'm not saying that straight covers are a bad thing, but the ones from Teal just sound soulless and border on karaoke at times. Speaking of which, the instrumentals of these songs are putrid. It's Weezer doing their usual thing with the most tacky sounding 80s synth thrown in there for good measure. The synth alone sounds like ass. If this wasn't a cover album and it used that synth, I would still hate it. Unsurprisingly, the only cover I like off this album that I listen to somewhat regularly is the Africa cover. I actually think the synths sort of fit the overall vibe of that song since, the original already had this laid back kind of feel to it. And, it feels like they put some genuine effort into that one. Other than that, the only song I sort of liked was Mr. Blue Sky. And that's it. That's it. That's all she wrote, folks. The rest is just overproduced synthetic garbage. To be honest, most of the songs I'm indifferent towards. Like, there's very few songs on this album where I actively like the original. But contrary to popular belief, I'm not dumb. I know what these songs are supposed to sound like, and there's nothing these covers give me that the originals already don't. Take On Me, like, that version here lacks any of the passion and bite the original has. Like, the synth they use doesn't even come close to capturing the same, like, urgency almost as the original Aha version. Like, it doesn't feel right to me. Not to mention that covering Take On Me, while tempting, is tricky because most people, including Rivers, do not have the vocal range to hit the same high notes as the original lead singer of Aha. If I had to sum the Teal album up in one word, it would be frustrating. I went into it with an open mind. A Weezer cover album has loads of potential, seeing as my first exposure to the band was from a pretty faithful cover of You Might Think. And I was genuinely curious to see what it is about this album that everyone hated. It's a cover album. How bad could it have been? Turns out, pretty bad. Even while listening to the album, I found myself growing more and more frustrated just knowing how these songs are supposed to sound, but having to hear them be just botched by awful production. Instead of covers that take the songs in their own direction and add a Weezer flair, it's just soulless, with no connective tissue holding any of them together. It's just radio-friendly, Weezer-adjacent songs that everybody has heard a million times before. I think if Teal did have a cohesive theme, like a tribute album, or did bands that cited Weezer as an influence, or ones that got popular around the same time, or just a f***ing covers compilation of ones they've done in the past, then maybe I would be less harsh on it. But that's not what we got. Instead, it's a cash grab that ended up becoming a punchline. But speaking strictly from a songwriting perspective, these are still solid songs. Sure, they sound like ass here, but it's enough to put it over Raditude for me. Anyway, on to the real follow-up to Pacific Daydream. Only a few months after Teal, Weezer dropped the Black Album, which was quite highly anticipated, as it was originally announced as the follow-up to White. However, it faced several delays, especially after Pacific Daydream kind of went off and became its own thing. If you had to picture what a Black Album would sound like, what would you guess? Maybe this time it's more like Pinkerton to contrast to White. Or, maybe they could do a metal album as a tribute to Metallica. Or something else entirely. I don't know. No, they chose to be more pop sounding than the last proper album. Now, I'm not one of those fans who thinks that, everything needs to sound like Pinkerton. Like I said, I'm not immediately opposed to when artists change up their sound. Fortunately, this time, Weezer did commit a lot more heavily to the pop sound that they originally started with on Pacific Daydream. It doesn't feel like they're just adding normal Weezer elements to pop songs anymore. Like, it feels like these are meant to be pop songs. And I really appreciate that aspect of the album. And it's part of the reason why I think it's just a little bit better than Pacific Daydream, in my opinion. But at the same time, it did make the album feel a lot more manufactured. The first three songs, I think, are all great. Can't Knock the Hustle is so damn groovy. The bass line on that track goes so hard. But sure, Rivers may have unironically said, "I'm not like other boys," and the synth horns sound so MIDI sounding, but it doesn't matter to me because I'm just having a good time grooving out. I listen to that song way too much. Zombie Bastards, on the other hand, well, not as good. It's still a pretty fun time, even if it's like the anti-Back to the Shack in a way. The song overall just gives me like really strong Splatoon vibes for some reason. However, the chorus does feel like it was really wanting to become a viral TikTok dance trend. Wait, was it still Musically at that time? I don't remember. But by far, the best song on the album by a country mile is High as a Kite, a song tackling the subject of escapism. But when I first listened to the album, I took the lyrics literally and thought it was about drugs, which, it still could be. Some people use drugs as an escapist tactic. Speaking of the lyrics, when I stopped taking the song at face value, I realized just how nebulous they really are. It never explicitly states why he's turning to escapism or what he's escaping from, which allows it to fit to anyone's personal experiences really well. Even still, the verses state that while escapism can be a good thing, it can quickly escalate into ignoring your life's problems. Not to mention the soaring chorus that really complements the more toned down verses as well as the explosion of a bridge. I just kind of wish that the production was a little bit toned down at certain places, but I feel like the grand sound of it all just works well with this style of production. I have zero qualms saying that High as a Kite is not only the best song off of Black, but the best song from Weezer since the White Album, and if I feel like pissing a lot of people off, I'd even go as far as saying it's the best song from EWBAITE, but I feel like that even would be pushing it. I remember listening to those 3 tracks back to back and thinking, damn, these songs are pretty good. If the rest of the album continues to be like this, it might not be that bad. Am I gonna like Weezer's Black Album? Are the haters wrong? Turns out I was wrong! The album takes a dip in quality after High as a Kite that it never recovers from. Living in LA isn't awful, it has a catchy chorus, but it just lacks substance. It at times goes into car commercial core and must be what Scaled and Icy sounds like to people who hate that album. Also, the chorus is Smart Girls. I might not remember much from Hurley, but I remember that song sucking. Piece of Cake is like AJR levels of quality. I'm just being honest, was fine, and The Prince Who Wanted Everything is just boring as hell. The only other song I was fond of was Byzantine. It gives strong Beck vibes, like if he made the opening theme song to like a 1970s TV show all about the latest and greatest technology. That's followed up with California Snow, a generic-ass rap-adjacent sounding song that just sucks, and I hate it. When will Rivers learn to stop rapping? It's not funny, you're not good at it, it's cringe as hell. On the whole, the Black Album is passable. It's nothing too egregious and does the pop sound a little bit better than Pacific Daydream, with significantly less overproduction, since a lot of these songs just don't feel like a wall of sound like on Pacific Daydream. However, it's at the cost of having the same passion as that album did. But on that same token, Black has more songs that I come back to, so it's this really odd trade-off. I don't think this album is anything terrible, it just seems like a missed opportunity to maybe pick up some of the slack from the last release. Also, I do feel like they wasted the black color on this album. It should have been the foil to white instead of, being mediocre. But I do guess it was the opposite in a way, where white was really good, this album was mediocre at best. Before I move on, I do want to bring up what will probably be the Black Album's, and to a lesser extent Pacific Daydream's, Achilles heel. In that, I do not think that the Black Album and Pacific Daydream will age all that well. Since right now we're less than a decade removed from these albums, and they were trying to go for this super modern pop sound, I think as we continue to grow further and further removed from these albums, that they will continue to sound more and more dated. At the moment, they still sound quite contemporary, but as new sounds and genres emerge in the coming decades, they will always sound stuck in the late 2010s. The same year as Teal and Black, Weezer announced that they had not one, but 2 albums slated to come out in 2020. But as we all know, the world got struck by the bubonic plague HD remaster, and those plans got put on ice. Fortunately, most of both albums were already done, but they were still postponed to 2021, because the world was already in a bad place, and we didn't need Weezer. So in January 2021, Weezer released OK Human. And if Black was too synthetic, then OK Human was the complete opposite, in that everything was as analog as it gets. Because this time, there's a full string orchestra across all the songs. I was aware of this going in, and I was a little bit afraid that this would make the album feel super pretentious and full of itself, but instead I was pleasantly surprised with how the whole thing came together, because this whole project just oozes with atmosphere in every single song. And what I think helps this is that instead of adding orchestral parts to traditional sounding Weezer songs like they easily could have, they make traditional Weezer songs orchestral. That's to say that any of the tracks on this album could be done in the band's normal sound, as we know, like from the Blue album, and it wouldn't feel out of place. They still have all that signature charm that Weezer is known for, but have an extra layer of depth due to the unique sound of OK Human. It honestly makes me want to hear what most of Weezer's back catalog would sound like if done in this style. They did cover some big hits like Island in the Sun, Buddy Holly, and a couple others during a live stream performance of the album, but there's a part of me that just is dying to hear the entirety of EWBAITE done in the style of OK Human. I feel like it would really amplify the cinematic gravitas that album has to it. The album opens up with the ever atmospheric All My Favorite Songs, not the AJR version. which does a really good job of easing you in to the album. The strings aren't too in your face, and they do really make up for the album not having much guitar on it at all. Once they ease you in, each of the tracks cleanly fade in from one to the next for the most part, and that momentum is carried from one song to the next. Whether it be the awkward funkiness of Alugobi, the Book Illusion-filmed Grapes of Wrath, my favorite song from the album, or the Red Album feeling screens, all ending with the strange La Brea Tar Pits as the closer. The string melody on that one is really nice, especially when it rubs right up next to Rivers' vocals. It's just so satisfying. Another aspect of this album that I really enjoyed was how they used acoustic guitars. They're used sparingly throughout the album, but when they do, they add so much. But when they do appear, it never feels like they're compensating for the lack of them on the album. Instead, they either do their own thing or benefit the strings in some really interesting ways. I'd argue that OK Human is more of a musical experience than a normal album. I know I sound like a huge snob when I say that, but I feel like OK Human is something that's best experienced from front to back in one sitting. That's not to say that you can't listen to individual songs on their own. I've done that before, but it's just, there's something about it that just works that much better when all the songs are together in order. While certain songs from OK Human do get played by me from time to time, it's not really one of Weezer's albums that I come back to all that often. Kind of like Pinkerton in the sense that I did like the album, but I just don't really feel like coming back to it all that much. While Pinkerton, it's because of a myriad of different reasons. With OK Human, it's just because it sounds so different from the type of stuff that I usually listen to. So while I can safely say that this is a much better album than the Black Album, I can't help but listen to Can't Knock the Hustle more. But that differentness, while it does hold a bit of replay value back for me, is honestly the thing that I appreciate most about this album. It gives it a real sense of identity that previous Weezer albums lack. As I said, it's the opposite of Black in the sense that it didn't care if it's popular. Rather, it's focused on doing its own thing and being different and breaking the mold. But at the same time, it still sticks to what makes Weezer work in the first place. It takes that sound and amplifies it in a different way. Interestingly, the next album, while not the tonal opposite of OK Human, I would say it's the creative opposite of OK Human. A mere 4 months after OK Human, Weezer struck back with Van Weezer. Where OK Human was trying to do its own thing and trying to be different, Van Weezer was more of a return to form, giving us more of what you'd expect from a traditional sounding Weezer album with a bit of a twist. This time being metal, I think? Going into this album, given the shitty cover art and general idea, it all had mega cringe written all over it. But it turns out Van Weezer wasn't that bad. I'm in no position to say this, but I wouldn't really say that this is a metal album unless you count like really shreddy guitar solos and drums that are a little too prominent in the mix as metal. The songs themselves are solid, but nothing too outstanding. Hero is a good opener that does a great job of bringing Weezer back to basics with a really catchy chorus. I'm also quite fond of The End of the Game, as it's my favorite track from the album. The Island and the Sun Callback was pretty clever, and while this is a love song, I also interpret it as being about nostalgia, which one day I may want to further discuss how Weezer uses nostalgia in their music. I interpret the lyrics as someone wanting to reconnect with all the people who have exited their life, and reminiscing on all the good times they shared together. The fact that it was also the lead single released in 2019, a year that I hold a lot of nostalgia for myself, also helps this feeling for me personally. The acoustic closer Precious Metal Girl was interesting. When I was listening to it for the first time, I wasn't sure if I liked it, but by the time it ended, I'd come around on it and concluded that it was one of the songs I enjoyed. It was trying to be like Endless Bummer, even if that song is leagues better, but it's still a decent little song to end the album on, even if it is basically just River simping for an alternative girl. I'm not dumb enough to get into the argument on the nuances of alt style. To be honest, I don't really have that much to say about Van Weezer. Pretty much every song starts the same way, has lyrics that are about Rivers acting like he's young, but it's not like Raditude, so it's not cringe, and all climax with a big guitar solo. It also suffers from a problem that a lot of modern albums I'm noticing are facing, where the first half is significantly better than the second. Also, from a purely meta perspective, I feel like this album should have been the Black Album for hopefully obvious reasons. All in all, Van Weezer is a perfectly fine album. It's nothing groundbreaking, but nothing I'm going to complain about. It was a return to form for Weezer with a metal twinge, and it succeeds in that regard. And thank God they didn't do a single Van Halen cover on this entire album. Yes, I'm lumping all of Seasons together. They're EPs. Bite me. These are the first Weezer releases I was there for, specifically Seasons Winter, since I got into them around the time Seasons Autumn came out, but I didn't listen to these EPs because I was still getting into Weezer at the time. So I was excited to see what Seasons was all about, but I couldn't shake the similarities to Green Day's Uno Dos Tre that it was giving me. I was worried that these would be 4 EPs that didn't need to be separate releases, and Seasons Spring didn't help this. It was arguably more of a return to form than Van Weezer was, and played it even safer. It does the springtime vibe pretty well, with a lot of tree hugger composition and sound, not to mention an abundance of Shakespeare references for some reason. But to be honest, I really haven't had the urge to come back to anything from this EP. I'm not a fan of the overall sound of it, and while it does have its moments, it wasn't the best first impression for this series of 4 EPs. Season Summer, on the other hand, is where things start to get really good. I'd actually go as far as to say that this EP is on par with OK Human. It takes the mid-2010s Weezer sound and throws in some heavier production more akin to Van Weezer, which culminates in this sounding more punk than anything else in their discography had up until this point. This one includes the big hit Records, which I do understand why this was such a big hit. It does kind of give me the same vibe as something like Beverly Hills, and I did really like that song too. Other tracks I liked were The Opposite of Me, What's the Good in Being Good, and Thank You and Good Night. Seasons Autumn carried the momentum of Seasons Summer and moved it in a more depressing direction. It seamlessly blends their classic and modern sounds and is all strung together with a strong atmosphere that permeates throughout most tracks. Opener Can't Dance, Don't Ask Me gets across that this EP is going to be filled with lyrics about anxiety while instrumental dance punk plays throughout, which, as a fan of Franz Ferdinand, I really liked. What Happens After You, Francesca, and while it may not be for everybody, Tastes Like Pain are all killer songs. And while I might like this one a little bit more than Summer, they're honestly pretty equal in my opinion. After this, I was a little worried that Seasons might not stick the landing and that Seasons Winter might not live up to Seasons Autumn. But boy, I was wrong. Because Seasons Winter, I would argue, is Weezer's best release since the White Album. Right off the bat, I Want a Dog is literally just a better version of Hold Me from Make Believe, which I love that song, so it was really cool to hear that. If Seasons Autumn was a mix of both old and new Weezer, Seasons Winter is old Weezer. Basketball, especially when the guitar comes in, is just like in the garage, and The One That Got Away is essentially a better version of Only in Dreams. I'm also glad that only one song, Dark Enough to See the Stars, sounds like a Christmas song, because that was like my biggest fear going into this EP, is that they would just all sound like Christmas music, and I'm glad they mostly steered clear of that. Other than Sheraton Commander, Winter from front to back is not only great as a standalone work, but conclusion to Seasons as a whole. So was Seasons a played out project that didn't need to be 4 EPs? No, surprisingly. Each one of them had its own distinct identity in sound, and I think them not being albums really worked to its advantage so that each EP didn't feel like it overstayed its welcome. Especially seeing as each one was an improvement over the last, it really felt like they were improving as they went on. So, Seasons was worth it in my opinion. Still should have called it Weezens though. So, that's where things stand with Weezer today. As I'm filming this, the band is currently on their 30th anniversary Blue Album tour and have teased another album sometime in the future, so there's at least that to look forward to. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? What lesson can be learned here? I don't know. Initially this started so I wouldn't have to talk about them ever again. But knowing me, I'm going to do so in the future at some point. It may not be like an album deep dive or something like that, but I feel like I will talk about them in some capacity again one day. But what really matters is that I get it now. I understand the Weezer experience firsthand. They have some really high highs and some lows that make me question why I even like this band to begin with. But even at their worst, there's always some diamonds in the rough. They can be fun, geeky, serious, and weird. But at the end of the day, they're still Weezer. And until next time, See you around.